I want to officially welcome you to our 14th annual Christian Thought Forum. So welcome and thank you for coming. It's almost hard for me to believe that we have been doing this for 14 years. I lose count all of the time. And we have a special treat tonight. In fact, we have as our speaker Doug Geivett, who was our very first speaker for the very first Christian Thought Forum. So you could refer to him as Doug Geivett tonight, or the OG, whatever seems most appropriate to you, because he got this thing started with us. At that time, he came and delivered sort of a refutation of a speech that Richard Dawkins gave and his book called The God Delusion. Richard Dawkins was invited to UAF, and we felt like that message could not go unrefuted in our community. And so we invited Doug to come up and refute that, and also to talk about evidence for the resurrection. And that's what he did 14 years ago. And while he was here, he also went up to UAF and participated in a debate there against the head of the philosophy department with Dr. Eduardo Wilner. And Dr. Wilner was gracious enough to set that up, and we had about 200 students that showed up, 200 students, faculty, so that was a really fantastic event, and Doug did a phenomenal job representing Christianity there. We were very proud of him. So I want to just let you know, in addition to being a professor, Doug is also a skilled debater, so don't pick a fight with him this evening. So he has debated well-known atheists such as Richard Dawkins and Michael Shermer. Tonight, I want to draw your attention to your program. I hope you have one. If you don't have one yet, you will want to sneak out and get one. That will be important for you this evening. So make sure you get one of those. And tonight, we're going to have 2 talks from Doug, followed by a question and answer time. So again, the first talk will be on Christian nationalism. It'll be followed by a 30-minute break for some food and refreshments. And then we will come back for a free book giveaway, so you won't want to miss that. And we will also at that time take an offering. So I want to give you a heads up for that. If this kind of an event is important to you and you want to see it continue and you would like to support it, there's an opportunity to do that. In your program on the last page, there is a QR link that you can take a quick shot of. It will take you to a giving platform where you can donate to that. If you're not so inclined to use technology for those kinds of things, you can write a check if you know what a check is. We also take cash. If you're gonna give us a check, you can make it out to Bethel Church and just notate CTF in the memo line if you would. And then after that short break, we will listen to part 2 of Doug's talk, and then that will be followed by a Q&A session in extended time, and so you will want to be preparing your questions for that. And I want to tell you how we're going to do that this year. We're going to do it a little bit different. So again, we're going to utilize basically the QR link as a way that you can go again, this is in the back of your program or on the back of the seats in front of you. You can take a shot of that. It will take you to a platform where you can write in your question. You can give us your name or not, and those questions will populate on a tablet, and then I will moderate the questions for Doug during our Q&A time. So that's how that will work. If you don't want to use the QR link, you can use Bethel.church. Just type that into your browser, and that will take you right to the event. So I hope that's clear enough. If it's not, grab me in between sessions. So let me introduce our speaker. Formally, Doug and his wife Diane live in Southern California. They have 2 grown daughters, so Doug is a girl dad. He is a professor emeritus at Biola University. He has a Ph.D. from the University of Southern California, an M.A. from the Dallas Theological Seminary, and an M.A. from Gonzaga University, and a bachelor's degree from Multnomah School of the Bible. Doug's interests range over the philosophy of religion, philosophical theology, epistemology, and the history of modern philosophy. He is the author of Evil and the Evidence for God, and co-editor of Contemporary Perspectives on Religious Epistemology and In Defense of Miracles. He's also co-authored another 4 books on the New Apostolic Reformation movement. He has been the president of the Evangelical Philosophical Society. He has spoken on issues related to Christian nationalism, the New Apostolic Reformation, Christian apologetics, and the Christian life to audiences all over the world. And I will tell you, in addition to having a brilliant mind, Doug has a pastoral heart. 14 years ago, he stood in our kitchen and he spoke to my, at that time, 10-year-old son, taking his theological questions seriously. And 14 years later, my son is a graduate of the school that Doug teaches at, or has taught at, and I'm very grateful for that interaction. So he is a good mind, but he has a pastoral heart. So without further ado, I want to introduce to you my friend Doug Geivett.
Well, thank you so much, Eric, for that kind introduction and for hosting this event again this year and having me back after all these years. I will say I don't remember using QR codes 14 years ago for anything, much less for a conference event like this. So technology has certainly reached Fairbanks, and I know that's not funny to you. I used to give Holly Pivick a hard time because I just assumed that anything that I sent to her would reach her by dog sled, and I didn't know what schedule that would be, you know, how long. I'm not sure if she's even received things I sent years ago, to be honest with you. But I have a lot of friends in Alaska, in Nome and Fairbanks and Anchorage. And these are all faraway places for someone who lives in Fairbanks. It's such a big state with people who obviously have big and warm hearts to come out on an evening like this and hear a presentation. I want to thank you for being here. I wanted to say a little bit about your pastor, Eric, whom I met initially just coming here 14 years ago, and was in his home and talked to his son and others. And I've also known him through other people who know him in a different way. He was recently a student at Western Seminary doing a Doctor of Ministries program, and one of my former students is an advisor in the doctoral program there, and I was in his home just less than a month ago, and we were talking about his experiences with Doctor of Ministries students and some of the distinguished people that have come out of there recently, and he mentioned Eric and his fine dissertation, and I'm so happy that you have a pastor who has distinguished himself in his pulpit work, in his church leadership, but also in an academic setting like that. You are privileged to have him here, and I want to congratulate him again. I mentioned this to him last night, but I want to say again, I'm proud of the work that you've done. I'm glad that you're through that process. It's a great relief to get to that point, especially when you have the cares of a church that are your priority while you're also studying. Maybe you've heard of Christian nationalism. About 18 months ago, I was speaking in a church in the Pacific Northwest in a large town, a large city, on this topic. It was my first time to address the topic of Christian nationalism. And I began by asking the audience, similar to this audience, this question: how many of you have heard of Christian nationalism? And only, well, you anticipate me, I see. And only a few people raised their hands. I mean, 2 or 3 people raised their hands. I don't know if Holly remembers that. I think you were there. And that surprised me a little bit, but I would say that the awareness of it has grown quite a bit since that time. And I'm going to ask you now this question. If prior to hearing of tonight's program, you know, what the topic would be, you had already heard of this thing called Christian nationalism, how many would raise your hand and say, yes, I've heard of that? See, look at this. This is almost everybody, maybe everybody did raise your hand. And that's a very dramatic change in a short period of time. Now, I know that an experiment that was performed only 18 months ago in a different audience in a different part of the country might not be that telling, but there are a lot of reasons to make sense of this notion that it's on our radar more now than it was then, and that really relatively few people had heard the term just a short time ago. Now here we are on the eve, almost literally on the eve of an election. Are we 11 days away from voting for a president of the United States? We'll have a new president in due course very soon, and that will be determined in less than 2 weeks, just over a week. I completed my ballot just before leaving home to fly up here, and my wife said, she texted me today that she has submitted our ballots. So I'm done. I've voted. I've got mine in, and I'm anticipating a very interesting outcome. Not making any predictions, of course, but not just the outcome of the election, but what direction we're headed as a country and what our position will be on a number of issues and how we'll navigate some of the turbulent waters that we're faced with as a people in this country, but also globally, because the position of this country in the world is such that everybody is affected by a big decision like this, and we hold the power of that decision in our hands. It's interesting, isn't it, that we live in a country where we are represented by people that we have voted for, or not. But they're not there unless a majority of people or of the electoral college for presidents actually intends their service. Now, we have a primary in this country, so sometimes we hope for somebody else to become the candidate for the presidency who doesn't make it that far, doesn't get past the primary. And so then the person that is representing whatever party that we have registered with is different than the person we voted for in the primary for that party. That's true for everybody for the Democrats this year. That's a new thing in this country, right? The candidate for the Democrat Party was not nominated through the primary process. That's a fascinating development. Never happened in my lifetime. The candidate on the Republican side was the nominee and participated in 0 debates with all of the other candidates and still won the primary in enough states to become the nominee. Also, this person is an incumbent of sorts because he was president before, though not most recently. So that's a kind of unique development in our day and age. The Democrat candidate is more of the immediate incumbent than the former president is, because she's currently the vice president of the United States. So we live in times of very unique, novel developments. And we have the opportunity to participate because we live in a democracy where we get to vote. And I was thinking about that on my way over here, how many people do not vote. And so the candidate who will win the election may actually probably be elected by a relatively significant minority of people, because it's a minority of people who actually vote. And then if the vote is nearly evenly split, it's half of that at best. So you see, that's a very interesting thing that we take for granted when we don't vote, given the privileges and the power that we do. And there are people globally who would love to have the privileges that we do, and too many of us just don't take that responsibility all that seriously. Now, I know what some of the reasons are. I've heard, for example, people say, well, what difference is my vote going to make? I'm just one person. Have you ever thought that thought? You know, if I just sit it out this time around, is it going to make any difference at all? But if everybody who didn't vote for that reason, and you could persuade them all to get a different reason and vote anyway, that would change the whole equation, right? So we can't have everybody thinking, well, my vote won't count, right? So that's kind of an interesting irony, in fact. Now, we do see that in various places around the country, there are so-called swing states or purple states or states where the vote could go either way, and it's sort of already predetermined that other states, people there apparently don't even need to vote, right? Because it's already been decided. California's blue, Oklahoma's red, right? And so on, and you just look at the map and you can see what's foreordained. But I wonder how much our predictions would be reliable if more people actually voted, right? If more people voted, or more people, let's say more people in the Christian church in this country voted than usual. It's surprising to me how many do not. And I've wondered what difference it would make in states even considered to be red or blue might be quite different in their actual determination if the majority of Christians, people in the church in those states actually voted. You could surprise all the pollsters by getting more involved at the last minute. Now, here's another reason why many people withhold their vote. And it's because, and this one I resonate with a little bit more. It's because to vote responsibly, you need to have good information. You have to know what your options are. You have to know things about candidates, or in California we have proposition and measures, and you have the parallel or counterpart to that in Alaska, I'm sure. State concerns, local concerns. And that's a lot to keep track of, and it's a lot to know and to learn about, even if there are huge fountainheads of reliable information just flooding towards you. It could be overwhelming trying to assimilate all the information you need to feel like your vote is responsible, because you're voting from a position of knowledge or well-grounded belief. And I don't want to vote if I don't think I have pretty good knowledge of what I'm voting about, for or against. And that's assuming that we have reliable sources. But how many Americans trust our sources today? That's a serious problem that we have, and it's a problem that democracies face naturally, especially large ones like ours, where there are so many millions of people whose interests are at stake. And so how does the word get out, and how do we test our sources? I went to a meeting in a home once in South Orange County, California, where I live in Orange County, and I went to South Orange County with a friend to a meeting where one of the United States senators was speaking. He was from another state, and he gave a really good presentation, and we were talking. He opened it up for questions, and there were probably only 30 or 40 people there. So it was easy to get your question in, and I said, my question is, how do I function as a responsible citizen in the world, in this country, and vote responsibly if I don't have reliable sources of information that I can trust, so that I'm voting with knowledge, or at least with really well-grounded belief? And he said to me, that's the $64 million question. And I thought maybe he didn't know about inflation. I thought, it's a bigger question than that, right? And then he proceeded to tell me what I kind of would have thought he would consider to be the more reliable sources among our options, given his party and his general policy positions. If I'd have been talking to somebody from the other side of the aisle, as we sometimes hear people say, I probably could have predicted what sources that person would have recommended. But see, that presumes a certain amount of knowledge. And so we can, if we work at it and we do due diligence, then we can obtain information that can be helpful in our decision making. And then we don't have a good excuse not to participate in the process. And I'm going to be affected by your vote, and you'll be affected by my vote. My children will be affected by your vote, and your children will be affected by mine. We have responsibilities towards each other and not just our own private interests when we participate in a democratic and republic type of country like we have. And I think it's good to think these thoughts, to feel responsible and motivated to do this thing that we do once every 2 years if you participate in the general election and the midterm, or only once every 4 years if you reserve your vote for general elections only. It's not that big of a thing to do, but the implications are quite significant. And I hope that you'll have other reasons to take seriously this privilege, this opportunity that you have as a result of things that we talk about this evening. So we've established that most here have heard of Christian nationalism. My goal is to say something about what it is, to think about ways that we could evaluate it and assess it, size it up and determine what we think about it, what we should think about it, and then also how we should position ourselves in relationship to Christian nationalism. So what is it? What should our evaluation be? And then how should we position ourselves in practical terms in relation to this movement called Christian nationalism? Now, one of the easiest things you would think would be to define it. And we would start with a definition and then just move on to evaluation. And that is an attractive thing to do, of course. But while we might think that definition is the right place to begin and hope that it's not too difficult to do, we might find in the actual effort to define it that it's not as easy as we had hoped. And I thought when I first began to research this movement that it wouldn't be that difficult to really define it. It might be hard, like any definition is, to get it so clear in your mind that you know for anything that is offered as a candidate for being that, it either is or isn't. We call that knowing the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be what it is. So for some position to count as an instance of Christian nationalism, you'd want to know what does it take to be that, and what would be enough for it to be that. What it would have to be like in order to be Christian nationalism is a necessary condition. If it didn't have that feature, then it wouldn't be Christian nationalism, because it's necessary for the movement that you're thinking of to have that feature for it to count as Christian nationalism. So that would be a necessary condition. A sufficient condition would be one that might not be necessary, but if it turned out that it had that feature, that would be enough to qualify it as an instance of Christian nationalism. So that's an interesting thing. Now, there is no such thing as Christian nationalism unless there are at least some sufficient conditions for it. So at the very least, we want to get clear about what some of those are. And even if we don't know what all the necessary conditions are, or we can't stipulate all the necessary and sufficient conditions for those of you who care about that kind of rigorous definition, we can at least try to characterize it and describe it so we can say, yes, I think I've got a handle on this. I think I know what we're talking about. I've seen instances of this, and I would say this is a case of that. Or this person is a proponent of that. Or this person is a critic or advocate for something else instead. Another thing that we want to be clear about is the difference between a clear case of something and a less than clear case of something. So think of any class of objects that might interest you and consider the possibility that it can sometimes be hard to draw the line between cases that things that are part of that class of things and things that aren't, because around the edges, it gets a little blurry. Let me give you an example. Beards. Yeah, I said beards. Okay, now there are people in this room, I've looked around and I'd say, okay, there are men in this room who have beards. All right? And there are clear cases of it. I mean, the longer, the fuller, the more obvious it is, right? The thicker the beard, the clearer the case. Have you ever seen cases where you weren't sure? You ever seen that? You know? I know, don't get too personal here, but and you're just not sure. They're the less than clear cases, right? You say, well, you know, there's some patches where it's not growing in too well. Is that a beard or not? Or it's a little thin, you know, on the side or something like that. Is that a beard? Somebody could grow a really nice goatee, but that's not a beard yet, right? So what is a clear case and what isn't? Or you might say, well, I've seen clear cases of people not having a beard, clean shaven, totally clean shaven, or maybe they've never shaved, but they look like they've shaved recently, okay? No beard, no evidence of it, no question, right? Clear case of that. But then you might say, gee, I'm wondering now, are you trying to grow a beard? And you don't want to be asked the question, are you trying to grow a beard? Okay? That's not the right question, people. It's better to say, oh, are you growing a beard? Because then they feel like, yeah, well, especially if they are trying. That's the way you want to ask the question, all right? So what is a clear case and what isn't? And then there are these boundary cases that just are not clear, and you're just not sure what to say about them. So I was communicating with a friend of mine who wrote a book on Christian nationalism. I just read the book, came out just a few weeks ago. And I asked him, do you think that so-and-so would be a Christian nationalist? I won't tell you who it was. And he said, well, I don't know. I don't know what to say about that person. That person, from his point of view, was not a clear case either way. He couldn't say, yes, clearly that person is a Christian nationalist, or no, that person is not. Now, it might be because, you know, he's just not familiar with his views. But this is somebody who's well known in public discourse. You see him on the news. You see him interviewed quite a bit. He's not a politician, but he is a prominent Christian leader that everybody's heard of. Just about everybody's heard of. And he talks about American politics. And so that's interesting. You could have a clear case of somebody who is clearly interested in politics as a Christian and not know whether he's a Christian nationalist or not, even if you have a definition. Does that make sense to you? And you might be able to think of cases like that. I mean, I am tempted to tell you who it is just so that you can say, oh, yeah, I guess I'm not sure either. Or maybe you say, oh, I would say yes, definitely. Or no, of course not. See, and we could have disagreements about who is in and who is out on some point like that. So this can get difficult. So what we want to do is describe the movement in such a way that we could feel pretty confident that we're on safe ground thinking of that as Christian nationalism, even if something else might also be that, but it's not as clear to us that it is. And then we could ask, okay, well, if somebody subscribes to these things, then wouldn't that make them a proponent of Christian nationalism? And I guess we would say yes to that. Now, if you're getting ready to give a presentation like I have been on this topic, I would say one of the things I'd want to do is survey the literature. That's just something academic people talk about. Well, what are all the other people saying? All the experts, the scholars, what are they saying about Christian nationalism? Because we're hearing it talked about. So what do they think it is? So we could start with a definition that somebody else has already offered and just run with it and say, well, okay, let's say that's what Christian nationalism is. Let's evaluate that and think about how to position ourselves in relation to that, right? We could do that. Or we could, if there were enough samples out there, we could see what various scholars or experts or students of this topic have come up with and compare them and see how much overlap there is and sort of disregard the differences around the edges and kind of run with the core things that they have in common and say, we've got enough definitions now on the table. We see overlap in these critical ways, and these are the things that they're the most confident about anyway. Now we feel better about our view about what Christian nationalism is. So we could do it that way. But then you have to ask the question, well, how did they do it? Did they do it just by calling each other up on the phone and saying, well, how would you define it? That's not how it works. So how would it be defined if you were trying to do it from scratch, as it were? And the way you would do it is you would start observing the culture and social phenomena, institutions, language that's being used, events that happen around us, and all that, and look for patterns in behavior, language, symbols that are used, principles that are advanced, books that are being referenced to support a cause. And obviously there's going to be causes involved here. What is your cause as a Christian nationalist? And you could ask questions like that. You could say, well, if you're a Christian nationalist, what would your cause be? What would your priorities be? Could you be a Christian nationalist in a different country besides the United States? And you start throwing a lot of questions down, and then you start looking around and trying to answer the questions based on the data that you're acquiring through observation, analysis, and synthesis. And one type of specialist who does this sort of thing is a sociologist, right? Sociologists do this sort of thing. They look at what's going on in society, aggregates of individuals, and try to look for patterns of things and demarcate differences in society and different groups within society, different movements that are happening around us in terms of things they're observing like I've been describing. And in fact, a couple of sociologists that I'll mention in a moment have written a book on Christian nationalism. And it's not surprising to me, given their interest in American religion as sociologists, that they would be studying that phenomenon and then cobbling together a definition that they think makes sense in light of what they've observed. So it's helpful to ask the question, how does the language even evolve? How do people decide what is and what isn't Christian nationalism? I think there are Christian people who don't know whether they're Christian nationalists themselves or not, because there are different accounts of what it is. And you might say, well, if it's this, then I think I might be. If it's this, well, then I'm pretty sure I'm not. See, and that's happening in the world today. Maybe some of you feel that way, some confusion about where you would actually plot yourself if it came down to it. And it turns out that Christian nationalism isn't just one thing. That aggravates the situation quite a bit. Now, here's another interesting feature of the definitional problem. It's this. When you read the literature, all these books on the topic, it turns out most of the books, by far, most of the books that you can get through Amazon today that are about Christian nationalism are by critics. That's interesting. That to me is an interesting thing to observe. That doesn't mean there aren't any Christian nationalists around. By the way, you could invent language like the terminology Christian nationalism to stand for a phenomenon in society, and it would apply to all the people that are classified that way, and yet no one in there would even know what Christian nationalism is by name. They might say, I've never even heard of it. How can I be one? But they could be. You could be a Christian nationalist and not know it, right? Because of the things you believe and the policies that you accept and so forth. Holly Pivick and I are co-authors of 4 books on the New Apostolic Reformation. A lot of people that are part of the New Apostolic Reformation would say, well, not so much anymore because everybody's talking about it, but they might say, well, I don't think I'm part of that. I don't even know what that is. But you don't have to know what it is to be functioning within its context and its framework. I mean, you could grow up an American and not know you're an American. It'd be hard. It would be hard to do it. But you could. You can imagine how that might happen. But even with many other kinds of things. You know, are you an evangelical Christian? Well, I guess I've always called myself that, but please don't ask me to define it because that's where I'm going to have trouble being clear about the boundaries. Or, you know, are you, I don't know, what do you believe about human freedom? How many people think we have freedom? And we can, when we perform we have a free choice at times to do something, and we were genuinely free. We're not determined. We could have done otherwise. Anybody think that here? I'm the only one? Okay, good. Okay. Now, I didn't ask you, are you a libertarian with respect to human freedom? Is that your view of the ontology of human freedom? You might say, the only thing libertarianism is something, that's a political view, isn't it? Well, it is, but there's also libertarianism in philosophy concerning human freedom. But most people have a view about freedom. They don't know what it's called. They don't know what the difference is between hard determinism and soft determinism and libertarianism and all that, but they're going to believe one of those things, probably, right? So we could be something and not know that that's what we are, but we would still be very convicted and convinced about the particular things that make us that. That doesn't mean that we're not committed. It doesn't mean that we're, even uneducated or illiterate. It just means that the language is never something we've ever learned to apply to what we actually believe. So you could discover, as we get into some of the description and definition, that you are closer than you think to being a Christian nationalist. Or you might think, oh, I guess I suspected I was, and now I'm pretty sure I'm not. You see? That can happen to you tonight. And that was without even changing anything you believe. So this is the problem with labels. I had a teacher in college once said, labels are libelous, because we can really do a lot of damage with labels. And we start saying that this person is a Calvinist, and this person's an Arminian, and this person, is whatever, right? Neo-evangelical, not evangelical. Or this person's a charismatic, and this one's a neo-charismatic. Please, help me, What's with all the labels? Labels are helpful if we know what we're talking about when we apply them. And that's why we need definition and description. You think, why didn't you just give us one, please? Why do we have to do all this? Because we live at a time when we're slapping labels on things and on people all the time and running the risk of creating tensions that don't have to exist in our effort to get along together in society and in the church, which I care about more than government, is the life of the church. Okay, so I hope that gives you some help here, and it will make a little bit of sense of what... Now, I said most authors writing about Christian nationalism are critics of Christian nationalism. How many books are there by Christian nationalists? Because what you might want is to find out, what do they mean by Christian nationalism when they call themselves that? And what if there's a difference? Wouldn't that be interesting? Well, there are two books that are clearly defenses of Christian nationalism by Christian nationalists. And I'll give you the titles in a minute. Now, there are probably a few others, lingering, hanging around. But these are the two books that are kind of the best known and the most talked about. And what I discovered, to my dismay, is that there's a disconnect between how they characterize Christian nationalism and how most of the critics do. There's a lot of overlap among critics and not much overlap between those critics on the one hand and these two books by so-called Christian nationalists themselves. Oh. So now what do you do? Well, you got to understand that there are differences in nuance and sense. And I'm going to mention that, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say that what the critics are talking about does exist, but it might be different than what the self-identified Christian nationalists who've written these two books are talking about. Okay? And that instead of talking about what they're talking about, we'll talk about the Christian nationalists that the critics are all worried about. Because that's really the ultimate reason why we're here talking about this, is because of what the critics are saying in light of things that they're observing. And I think you'll agree that what they're observing is really happening. Even if the things that they're observing are not being represented systematically in any book by a Christian nationalist of that sort. Okay? So, just to illustrate, here are some books. Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States by these two sociologists, Whitehead and Perry. The Flag and the Cross, White Christian Nationalism and the Threat to American Democracy by Gorski and Perry. Same Perry as for the other one. Here's one by Pamela Cooper White, The Psychology of Christian Nationalism, Why People Are Drawn In and How to Talk Across the Divide. That's a psychological study, how to have a conversation with people in that tradition. Kingdom Coming, The Rise of Christian Nationalism, Michelle Goldberg. Catherine Stewart, pictured here, wrote a book called The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. Well, then you might want to say, well, wait a minute, she's not using the word Christian here. Is she talking about something different or broader that includes Christian nationalism but other things too? Those are good questions. Maybe you've seen this title, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. Now you're starting to get a sense just from the labels, the titles and the subtitles of what people are pointing to, what they're referring to here. But this author, this woman, has also been an endorser. She's written a lot of endorsements of some of the more recent critics or critical treatises on Christian nationalism. Here's another one, The Everyday Crusade, Christian Nationalism in American Politics, 3 authors. Notice the imagery on these, right? You've got a cross and a flag. The 7 deadly sins of white Christian nationalism, a call to action. Look at the imagery. Here's one by a very respected scholar called The Religion of American Greatness, What's Wrong with Christian Nationalism? He's a Christian, by the way. White evangelicals and right-wing populism, how did we get here? That sounds like it's going to be about the genesis of this movement and how it took the path that it did. Here's an image on the right-hand side. You probably recognize that silhouette. Isn't it interesting how everybody here knows who that is, right? It's amazing how images work. Unholy, why white evangelicals worship at the altar of Donald Trump. Was that Donald Trump? Yeah, of course, that's who it is. So now we brought Donald Trump into the discussion with this title. Where does he fit in? The founding myth, why Christian nationalism is un-American. Christian nationalism is un-American. So here it seems like the concern is going to be on the political side and whether you could be a legitimate American advocating for something like Christian nationalism. Or by Gregory Boyd, The Myth of a Christian Nation, how the quest for political power is destroying the church. So he's associating Christian nationalism with a grasping for power and saying this is bad for the church. Just from the title. Okay? American idolatry. That's strong language. We've seen Andrew Whitehead's name earlier on another title. How Christian nationalism betrays the gospel and threatens the church. Now, some Christian analysts have said that Christian nationalism is idolatrous. Others have even said it's heresy. So what are they thinking when they use these labels? Obviously, not all Christians are Christian nationalists, at least not in their own eyes. So to be a Christian is not to qualify as a Christian nationalist. And these are Americans, so to be a Christian American is not sufficient. It's not a sufficient condition for being a Christian nationalist. But I wonder if you know people who are not believers, not Christians, who if they found out that you were a Christian, might suspect that you're a Christian nationalist just on that basis alone. But that would be illegitimate, wouldn't it? Right? That wouldn't be reasonable to infer that anybody who's a Christian and an American is a Christian nationalist. Okay, so now we have evidence that Christians are divided on this topic. And that's going to be an interesting challenge for the church to work through. This is the book by a former student of mine, a good friend. We've co-authored things. American Christian Nationalism, Neither American Nor Christian. Michael Austin teaches philosophy at Eastern Kentucky University. I just read his book. And now some people would say, well, it sounds to me like he is opposed, right? Because it's neither Christian It's neither American nor Christian. That sounds like it's going to be critical of Christian nationalism, and indeed it is. And then you might think, well, Geivett was his teacher, and they've co-authored things, so maybe I know Geivett's position now. Right? What would that be? Austin's position? But you can't be sure of that either. I'm still not telling you what I think. Another gospel, Christian nationalism and the crisis of evangelical identity. You see how many people are writing about this? Joel Looper. The Everyday Crusade, Christian Nationalism in American Politics. I might have shown that one already. I recognize that imagery. Preparing for War. That's a strong title. The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next. Sounds like this author is a prophet. Matthew D. Taylor recently released this book, The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian movement that is threatening our democracy. Have you heard this name, Matthew Taylor? Okay. A faithful reader of the Orange County Register will have seen his name. I had a friend of mine show me the other day an article where he was quoted, and I've been seeing him quoted quite a lot. I've corresponded with him, partly about the New Apostolic Reformation, because he has an interest in that phenomenon as well. He's less interested in the theology and the biblical analysis that would help you evaluate the New Apostolic Reformation, something Holly and I have done. But he's interested in the role that the New Apostolic Reformation has played in politics and the important role it's played in strengthening Christian nationalism, and he's quite concerned about it. And I'm going to be quoting him again in a minute, or specifically in a minute. And he's one of the go-to people now. He is making the circuit in the news, in journals, in magazines, newspapers, and in his own book here. So he's getting quite a lot of attention with his critique of Christian nationalism. Jim Wallace's book, The False White Gospel, Rejecting Christian Nationalism, Reclaiming True Faith, and Refounding Democracy. So you see, to get your faith back and democracy back up and running, you've got to reject Christian nationalism. This is a Christian speaker, author. Tim Alberta, you might be wondering, how many of these are there? The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, American Evangelicals in an Age of Extremism. And now these are three books that are not specifically about Christian nationalism, but I think they were partly inspired by concerns about it and talk about it among these Christian scholars. N.T. Wright, Michael Bird, Russell Moore. Have you heard of any of these people? Okay, so these are people that are well known in evangelical circles for their faith and their solid scholarship on lots of issues. Some of them having to do with biblical studies, theology, others having to do with sort of social issues and the church. So by Russell Moore, Losing Our Religion, an Altar Call for Evangelical America. He talks about a broad swath of things, but included in that is he's got his eye on this movement called Christian nationalism, I'm sure. Michael Bird, Religious Freedom in a Secular Age, A Christian Case for Liberty, Equality, and Secular Government. He's an Australian scholar, teaches in a seminary there. And he's co-authored a book with N.T. Wright, Tom Wright, Jesus and the Powers, Christian Political Witness in an Age of Totalitarian Terror and Dysfunctional Democracies. And some people think, yeah, totalitarian terror and dysfunctional democracies are partly the fault of Christian nationalism. So there's this overlap. And then there are these books that are more like testimonials and discussions about how to talk as church people and evangelical people with compassion with people who are in the Christian nationalist movement. So we got the Star-Spangled Jesus, Leaving Christian Nationalism and Finding a True Faith, or The Ballad and the Bible. If I could, I'd read the subtitle for you there, and maybe you can read it and I can't. The After Party Toward Better Christian Politics. And then this one's interesting, a recent book by Caleb Campbell, Disarming Leviathan, Loving Your Christian Nationalist Neighbor. He talks about being a missionary to Christian nationalists. It was very interesting for me to read his response during an interview to the question, why would you consider yourself a missionary to them if you weren't going to consider them as unsaved people? And he said, well, I suspect some of them are. That's an interesting thesis. So, very interesting. Now I want to quote from The Violent Take It by Force by Matthew Taylor. He says, in the book, The Violent Take It by Force, you'll read about a particular form of Christianity whose escalating radicalization poses a real threat to pluralism and democracy. No mention of the church, the gospel, or anything like that here. That's not his interest. That's not his concern. His interest is in the threat posed by Christian nationalism to our democratic, pluralistic society. Okay? And as I said, he's getting a lot of attention. So that's one side of the concern, the political side. And then there's the Christian or religious side. The author of the foreword to the book, The Flag and the Cross, Jamar Tisby, he's not the author of the book, he writes this: white Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to the witness of the church in the United States today. Now, he's a Christian, has ministry, and he believes it's the greatest threat, at least in the United States, to the witness of the church. You know, it would have been interesting to ask you to just write down on a card coming in tonight. We could just collect the cards as you bring them in. Answer this question: what do you think is the single greatest threat to the witness of the church in the United States today? Now, if we'd have done it in anticipation of this meeting, you might say, well, maybe the right answer is Christian nationalism. But if we just did it out of the blue, what would you write? Would you write that it was Christian nationalism? So that's an interesting issue there. It might rank as a pretty significant threat to the witness of the church, or not. If you agree with him, you'll think so. But that could explain why we're having this talk at an apologetics conference, right? Your annual event is an apologetics conference. What's apologetics concerned with? It's concerned with commending the faith to non-believers on reasonable grounds and defending the faith against objections to the faith that could come from theoretical or philosophical or historical claims, or they could come from social and cultural claims. And that's what Tisby is alluding to, that we have a battle in the arena of cultural apologetics because of Christian nationalism. And Christian nationalism is creating a perception of the Christian church that is harmful to our witness as believers in this world. And so we need to address that if we're doing apologetics. So that would explain why we're talking about this here this evening. Now, I've already mentioned that there are two ways to approach the question. You can either consult appropriate authorities. The question, what is Christian nationalism? You can either consult appropriate authorities, or you can engage in analysis and synthesis and just do it from scratch and make all these observations and then figure out where the parallels are, where the overlapping things are, what the patterns are, and say that is what it looks like. And then you're going to be pointing to phenomena. And one kind of definition points to something and says, that's what I'm talking about. Okay? What's a piano? Well, that there is a piano, right? Now, that's not the kind of definition you get in Webster, but it's called ostensive definition in philosophy and logic. You point to something and say, there's an example of it, and that helps you know what it is. That's a piano. Okay? So now we have two cases, but look how different they are. Both count as pianos. I think, and I haven't studied this. It could be, this could be fake, but I doubt it. Why would that be? Now, there's one over there. I'm not sure why it's turned that way. But it certainly looks different than this. That's called an upright piano, and this one's a, what? Baby grand. It looks bigger than the baby grand that I have in my garage. Used to be a baby grand piano. Now it's all in parts. I have analyzed it to its individual parts. I say to this gentleman, this thing that you hold in your hand, that's a piano. Well, now you guys say, no, that's not. And I say, why? Because it looks different? Those two things look different. They're both pianos. No controversy about that. So why don't you just trust me on this one too? Well, because you're a philosophy professor and you probably don't know much about pianos. Well, I know philosophers who know a lot about pianos and are brilliant pianists, but I will admit I'm not one of them. Okay, so ostensive definition is risky. You point to something and call it that and say that's what that is, and you're supposed to know. Okay? Now you'd want to hear it played, you'd want to know what a piano really is, you'd need to observe more than just the case. And so we're going to have to do that when we come back from our break, is look at what this description is, and as we go, I'm going to be giving you my own analysis, telling you what I think is a good way to think about this movement called Christian nationalism. We've got plenty of time for this. That's why I've taken the time I have to kind of alert you to how much literature there is, the tone of it, how it varies from person to person, the risks of definition, the challenges of definition, but then we're just going to roll up our sleeves and do it. And I'm going to give you a description that comes out of Michael Austin's book. There's some other quotes I want to give you. And then I'm going to go through these 6 things that he describes that help you identify Christian nationalism. I'm going to give you my own evaluation as we do it. If we have time, we're going to look at a statement, relatively short statement, by Christians against Christian nationalism. And I might comment on that as well. Does that sound interesting? Okay, well, let's take a 30-minute break or come back whenever Eric says it's time. Thank you.